Okay, so first we'll tell our watchers that we're using a new microphone, so maybe they can hear me better. So thanks for the feedback, and maybe we'll get some feedback telling us that it's better or worse or not as good or just the same.
We do appreciate their feedback.
Hmm?
I said we do appreciate their feedback. So
Well,
if you're watching, thank you.
and we have some more to comment on, some more feedback. Well, what else? Well, one was that we should try to have shorter sessions. They were a little bit long for some people to fit them into their day. And so maybe we'll try to cut this one into two halves or something.
That sounds good. So
after about 30 minutes, try to wind up whatever we're talking about and start on something new.
Okay.
We'll see how that works. What was some other feedback?
There was one other piece of interesting feedback. Somebody had a question. Maybe it was about naming something.
Oh yeah, about our naming. That is telling how important names are, and I certainly appreciate that because well, that's the reason that we haven't named it, because we didn't want to pick a bad name and send us in the wrong direction. And we hope that feedback from our watchers will come up with something good, and then we'll do that. I've had that happen with several of my books. I had names that confused people, or actually, one time my publisher renamed a book the name I'd given and confused people. They thought it was a reissuance of another book, and so killed that other book. So we have plenty of experience with misnaming. Certainly, projects that have been named poorly. Nothing comes to mind at the moment. Well, some things like somebody invents another programming language and they call it magic something or other.
I know how you feel about the word magic in language names.
Yeah. So there's that. And, so names can be a tip-off, something like perfect in the name. And of course, you can put your own name personally in the name. We call this Marcus's Conversations or something, or Jerry's Conversations. That would be somewhat misleading. So anyway, we're soliciting some advice from our listeners. I guess we're just not smart enough to name things well. Certain societies in the world, including ours, I think, have a belief in what they call name magic.
Name magic. Okay.
Anthropologists talk about name magic. And if you know somebody, one form of this is if you know somebody's secret name, you have power over them.
This sounds like, I remember reading a science fiction story by Werner Vinge in high school called True Names, about if you knew someone's real name. It was sort of a pre-internet story, but there was a lot of power associated with that.
Yeah, that's typical thought in many societies. People have more than one name, and at least one of them is secret.
So is this a name that is known only to their most intimate of friends, spouse, family?
Only to themselves.
Only to themselves.
Maybe not even known to themselves.
Oh, very interesting.
Yeah.
So yeah, we got a question from YouTube, and this is what we're answering. Someone asked us, what are you trying to accomplish by asking, why do we need a name? So that's what we're talking about right now. Mm-hmm. The person also went and asked a second question, and they said, naming is one of the most crucial activities in software development. The right name can bring people to a common understanding. The wrong name can kill a project. I think it's an interesting question to say, what makes a good name in software? we could talk about the things that get named. I think there's a multitude, but what makes a name better or worse?
All right. Well, we can talk about that.
Okay.
First thing that came to my mind, and we may have talked about this before, I've certainly written about this. It's not just the name, but the collection of names. All right. So, for example, a lot of naming systems, especially I noticed that in COBOL programs, they have these naming systems where you get multiple names that are very similar to one another. They start the same and they end the same. They may have one digit different in the middle. And we know that that's confusing to people. When you read a name, or a word generally, people read the first few letters, maybe the last letters, and if they're different in the middle, they're easily mistaken one for the other. That's general reading knowledge. That's been experimentally shown. So certainly names that are too similar can cause a confusion in a program or in a project. And trying another observation about names is that if you try to make names that are meaningful, like part names, for example, so you have an inventory, you have part names, and you try to cram into the name things about when was the date that this part was issued, and how much it costs, and what kind of connections it has to other parts. And so you get these long involved names, which then turn out to have to be updated when the part is updated. Right? A lot of them no longer, same with projects. The name of the project may suggest something that is no longer true of the project. Projects often change course in the middle, right? And I'm trying now to think of one project that had a particularly bad name that also suggested this wasn't the name, but it was something like the name of the project was Hopeless.
Hopeless. So
what are you doing? We're working on the Hopeless project.
On the Hopeless project. You know, as you're talking, it reminds me of a freshman class I took in college. I think it was a C programming class, and we learned to name our functions to have the return type in them and like the parameters they took, and they were supposed to be a verb and a noun, and they taught us Hungarian notation. I think a lot of these naming systems aren't so much in vogue anymore, but I don't know that it's produced better names.
Right. In fact, I guess my suggestion would be for code, a style that I use is try to avoid names altogether. You can't avoid them altogether, but I mean, as much as possible, avoid names and try to avoid meaningful names because meanings change. And the name of the thing, like if you have say a subroutine with a certain name, and if the name describes something about what the subroutine does, that doesn't make the subroutine do that.
Well, hold on, Jerry. So let's pretend I have a subroutine that calculates the sum of numbers.
Supposed to calculate the sum of numbers.
And so I might give it a name called sum of numbers. That does not make it calculate the sum of the numbers. But I don't think you're saying that a better name could be sandwich or purple, right? That's not what you're saying. Those are very meaningless names.
Well, I don't know. They're not meaningless. What was it? Purple was one example.
Purple, sandwich, whatever.
Sandwich, those are meaningful words.
Well, they are. They don't have anything to do with calculating the sum of some numbers.
But somebody reads them and they think, why is this called purple?
They will wonder that. That's true.
So now you're confusing people. So they aren't meaningless names. They don't have a meaning in relation to what they're supposed to be describing. See, a name is one thing, a description is something else. And confusing the two things together, it causes trouble.
Your name is Jerry. Your description is not Jerry.
It doesn't describe me.
Right. Right. So do you think like
You
function?
get people doing, wait a minute, you get people doing that. They'll say, your name is Marcus. Yeah, he's a Marcus. Like that's supposed to mean something.
Well, maybe it's not so good when your name is turned into a description like that, but
Well,
it's
I
happened.
mean, there was a kid. Maybe we mentioned this before. So a few weeks ago, there was a story about this kid. His parents named him Adolf Hitler.
We did mention that.
Yeah. Okay. Now that's a name, and it's also a description in a certain sense. Right? Anytime, and there are a lot of examples of that. Like you could have a son named Marcus Jr.
Hmm.
Well, that's kind of now describes him as being a little smaller than you.
That's yeah. He'll go through.
And the kid grows up and he's bigger than you. And now he's junior, but he weighs 300 pounds and he's 7 feet tall.
Right, right. But everybody calls him Junior.
Right. And so the description may change, but the name is stuck there, you see.
Oh yeah, and this, I mean, I'm just sort of having a flood of memories of times when I've named the function, I've written the function to do what I felt the name would do. Then later I went in and I changed the function to do something else. I never changed the name because I didn't want to bother with all the places that called the function. But
Right.
now I'm left with this disconnect.
Right. And you are left with it, and everybody who has to deal with that program later, which is probably many times, often many times. And you see, one way to think about this is a name in a program is a comment. It's a form of a comment. And we've said things before, I think, about comments, how misleading they can be. You know, you see or how useless they are. Like there'll be you have your program that adds up a list of numbers.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you can have inside that program, you can have something called sum, and you can have a comment where it says add x sub I to the sum, and then your comment says add x sub I to the sum. What's the point? Right?
Sure, I guess you could actually take every line of code, duplicate it, put it in a comment somehow, and but you're right. There is also sort of now. Well, I don't want to go down this idea of like, do we need comments or not? But I want to come back to the name and the function that counts up numbers, and it has a name and it also does something, and those get out of whack sometimes.
Well, right. So don't call it something that could get out of whack. Just call it the function 3. Like it's the third function you have. Then you can have a one-line descriptive comment in front of it so people understand. Function 3 is supposed to add the numbers in the array X.
I have never seen this style of programming. Like,
that's the way I program.
oh, okay. So
Program.
I'm afraid maybe some people's heads are rolling around the room that are listening. So I just want to be clear because let's say you have 10 functions in your routine.
Mm-hmm.
You might call them function 1 through 10. Above them, you've got a line that indicates a comment that indicates what it does. And you put information in the comments about function 1 but the actual function name might be function 1, function 2, function 3. And that is one way to get around this problem of naming the name and the purpose getting out of whack.
Mm-hmm. There's no way they could get out of whack that way because there's no description in the name. Other than there may be function 1 and function 2 and function 3. That tells the reader there are 3 different functions, and I better look and see what they are.
It does force one to read the comment, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, but that's what you're doing. I mean, those comments and those names, for example, are not presented to the person using the program, right? We talked about that, I think, before, that should be, most cases, be totally hidden, right? So the user doesn't see those things. So they do what they do. The user, they do what they do, not what they're called.
Right.
I have an aphorism attributed to Abraham Lincoln, which I'd like to teach all my programming students and people in general. Lincoln had a riddle, and I'll ask you the riddle. Maybe we did this before. If you call a tail a leg, how many legs does a dog have?
I think last time I said 5, but this time I'm going to say 4.
Right. And why do you say 4?
Because last time you said a dog doesn't have 5 legs, even if you call a tail a leg.
Calling a tail a leg doesn't make it a leg, right? Calling a routine sum doesn't make it a sum.
There is, I feel like, okay, so I really think this is interesting. And I just have to ask, I'm sure the answer is yes, but just humor me. Have you seen companies adopt this naming model?
Some, yes.
And do they enjoy the benefits that you're describing?
Well, generally, the companies who are thinking this way, not necessarily by calling it a standard or something, but by they do reviewing each other's stuff, and they see what works better and what doesn't. They come to having actual standard instead of a standard document. And they tend to be companies that do code reviews regularly. They do pair programming and similar things, and so that their code is generally much more understandable, easier to modify correctly. I was going to say easier to modify, but you have to qualify that. It's easy to modify a program if it doesn't have to be correct.
Yeah, just hit the keyboard, you've modified it.
In that sense, software is soft. It's malleable, but means it's easily made wrong.
It seems like an interesting byproduct. Like I can remember times where I have a nice little compact function, maybe called add the numbers or sum the numbers. Mm-hmm. It starts to do more things. Mm-hmm. And then I start to think, well, it doesn't really, and now I have the dissonance in my head between what the function does and the name. It is much easier sometimes, if I'm feeling disciplined in the past, I might change the name.
Right. So what do you change it to? You change it to this function adds numbers and some other stuff.
Right. Adds numbers and compiles grocery list or whatever else it does.
No, just adds and some other stuff. That way you don't have to keep modifying every time you add some more stuff. It's still a description, right?
That's true. And now, and then when I find if I want to pull misleading, vague, it's actually more vague, right? So it might be technically correct and not very useful.
Well, you could call your functions some stuff. This is a function, does some stuff.
I used to have a programmer that called all his variables myvar, myvar1, myvar2. And I asked him what a myvar was. And finally he said, well, that's my variable.
Yeah. Well, I remember one program we had a terrible time trying to figure out what was wrong with it. And it was put together. The guy programmed, he had different ways of choosing names. So one way was sort of meaningful abbreviations like myvar. So one thing was called PAT for pattern, PAT for pattern. Another system he used was named after women that he knew. And was named Pat, P-A-T. And another system he used was sports terms, and he used P-A-T for point after touchdown, all in the same program. And they were for 3 different variables, and they got confused. And really, so yeah, your naming should be consistent in a way that avoids duplicates, of course. But also, I said before, avoid similar names. And PAT is very similar to PAT, and it's very similar to PAT.
It is.
So that rule should cover that. Okay.
It seems like if somebody wanted to sort of play with this idea, it doesn't seem like it'd be very difficult to write a piece of code that would change all your function names to function 1, function 2, function 3, that sort of thing. And then try and see if you can reason through it without that. and see if that adds, or maybe it removes readability. Maybe it actually adds readability because you stop worrying about, like, you actually start reading the contents of the function versus assuming you know what it does.
Well, for example, one thing strikes me right away. In a lot of programming languages, you can't tell just looking at the name the difference between a subscripted variable and a function call.
That's right.
Right? So it's just X parentheses something. If you name your functions all function 1, 2, 3, whatever, then, and you don't name your variables function,
right?
then at least you're already ahead of the game. You say, okay, oh, this is picking an element out of an array, or this is calling some function. I'd better look and see what the function is. And so, yeah, if you think through these things, at least there are certain principles that suggest stuff will be easier. And of course, you could test this out. If you do code reviewing, then you see when are people confused by what you've written, and then you go. If that's the point where you change the names to something less confusing. Right? Now, to base your, I was going to comment on Hungarian notation.
Oh, okay.
But Hungarian is supposed to be one of the more difficult languages to understand. The natural language.
The natural language, not the notation.
And it could be that basing your work on, basing your naming on a unknown language that's unknown to most people might be a very good way to prevent people from confusing names and descriptions, because I don't know any Hungarian words right offhand, but let's say you use German for people who don't know German, and you have a word like Weltschmerz is the name of your variable. Well, if you don't know German, that means nothing. Weltschmerz is a very emotive word in German.
Mm.
There's a lot of feeling, but if you don't know German, it's just W-E-R, and so that would be safer. Right? But of course, you never know. Some German speaker may pick it up. I remember being in northern Norway doing some courses, and people asked me, came up and said, they had a program from America. Did we talk about this?
I don't think so.
And they ran it, and it got into a one instruction loop, and they couldn't figure out what was going on. So they went into the code, and they looked, and this one instruction had a name, snafu.
S-N-A-F-U?
Yeah, and they looked in the dictionary, or the English dictionary, and they couldn't, because the other names were sort of meaningful English words. And they didn't know this, or they didn't have a slang dictionary or something, I don't know. And they couldn't figure it out, and they didn't know what to do, and they spent a lot of time. All right, see, that's what happens. So you can't really pick language that people don't know and people do know. It's best to keep descriptions and names separate.
Okay. You know, a part of me honestly wanted to propose that even if people aren't willing to go that far as to call things function 1, 2, 3, like in the same way as you mentioned with your book, the publisher retitled it. I know in my writing, I'm starting to realize I don't know the title until I'm done with it half the time.
Right.
So I wanted to almost introduce an idea of like, well, maybe waiting to name it is better, but I still feel like it doesn't get over the core problem that both can change the purpose of the function, the internals, and once they're out of whack.
Well, there's some discipline involved. If you are a code modifier, you're updating code, yours or that you wrote originally or your team wrote or something else, then you have to have the discipline. If you change a function and you use descriptive names, then you better think about it. Just like, because it's a comment. If you change the code, a comment describing the code better change, which you know from your experience, I'm sure, and I'm sure our listeners of written code know over and over again, the problem when they change the code and don't change the comment, and will send you off on endless mistaken routes and so on.
Terrible
So
problems.
it's not just a matter of the name you choose, it's a matter of your whole discipline of how you write programs, how you test them, how you modify them. That has to be coordinated in a meaningful way to keep your stuff current. And yet we have millions of aging programs around where the meanings of things are lost. Programmers leave, they're not there. People break up teams after they write a program, so nobody was around and knows anything about it. I mean, one of the mistakes people make about Agile is they say, well, the best documentation is the people who wrote the code. Well, that's true, but if you don't have them together anymore,
right? If you scatter them,
yeah, you break up teams when they finish code. Well, you never finish code, right? If it's being used, it's not finished because there's always a possibility it might modify it. So it's got to be understandable, if possible, to people who may have to pick it up later.
Well, we know that most of the cost and time spent in software, at least this is what I've always heard, is in maintenance.
Mm-hmm.
That's where most, and so I think what I'm coming to is that there is a hidden cost, a hidden complexity to naming functions, to naming things that we don't go into ready to be disciplined enough to handle or ready to pay the cost. We tend to think there's no cost, and so therefore we just say, well, everything needs a descriptive name. We don't realize the true cost to that is probably a lot higher than we're anticipating.
Yeah, and it's cost borne by somebody else.
Well, that is sometimes the best kind of cost, but
well, no, I mean, that's one of the things we found years ago. And Gary Okamoto and I studied generations of software from an IBM operating system, and we knew what had been troubles with it, and so on. And we were looking, what is the patterns of things that people do? And there were two things we found consistently, and other smaller things, but two things. Number one, above all else, was the existence of the name that had the letters TEMP.
In a variable or function?
Variable name or function name, TEMP.
And it was still around, huh?
Yes, okay, sometimes 5-10 years later, all right? Now, TEMP generally stood some sense of temporary.
Right.
Meaning, I'm too busy now to think this through, right? So I'm going to throw something in here, and I'll come back to it later, which I never did.
I never do. We never come back to it later.
Right? And so that was one of the things. The other was not in the names, but in the code. These were assembly language programs, and you have a branch, and it can go one of two ways. And for efficiency, a program, you had one way was more efficient than the other. Sometimes they didn't make a difference. But in programs that were written where the branches always went the same way, regardless of the situation.
The two conditions both say jump to the same place.
No. So you come to a place where you can either go straight through or branch out.
Okay.
Okay. And where they always took the straight through, for example, even though that might be not an efficient way to do it. What it told us is they wrote the branches always in the same style without thinking it through.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, from a point of view of efficiency. So you'd see that the program without some, what we identified were certain modules, certain components, which we coined the term error prone.
Okay.
Error prone. And over their lifetime, they had been a major source of the errors that had come in on this operating system. Okay. And so that we studied those, and this is where we found the TEMP in every one of them, right? And then we found this style thing, and basically both things say the same thing. These were written in a hurry.
In a hurry. And so that's an indicator of an error prone.
Yeah, I mean, well, if you write it in a hurry, it increased the chances it wasn't going to be done right. I mean, is that true of life generally?
It is in my life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
now let's do this, because we've reached.
So let's come back just one second to the original question about naming this thing. If we name it in a hurry, we're more likely to make a poor choice of name.
I think that's a nice way to wrap up this segment.